Hi, this is Empire of the Mind. I'm Dr. Bruce Gilley. If you've ever taken a class on European colonialism, you've probably been assigned the work of Frantz Fanon. He was a black psychiatrist born in the French Caribbean in 1925, who's best known for his bitter censure of colonialism while serving the insurgency against French rule in Algeria from 1953 until his death in 1961. It is wrong to treat Fanon as representative of the views of the colonized, or as an objective observer of colonialism itself. Most of the colonized were suspicious of metropolitan intellectuals like Fanon, as in other colonies, more Algerians fought for colonialism than against it. It's also not right to treat Fanon as an objective observer of colonialism. His work does not show or demonstrate or validate anything except what can happen when a displaced Martinican black falls prey to psychotic delusions. Nonetheless, one thing that admirers and critics of Fanon can agree upon is that his views reflect the views of the anti-colonial movement. The grim legacy of Fanon arose precisely because his words were translated all too faithfully into action by insurgents and post-colonial agitators, not just in Algeria but throughout the Third World. Those ideas can be summarized in one word: scapegoating. At the heart of Fanon's malevolent vision is an assault on European peoples. The French writer Pascal Bruckner called his writings the, quote, masterwork of a new theology, unquote, because they replaced the traditional scapegoats of prophetic theologies, the Philistines, infidels, Jews, with the white man. In Fanon's view, the virtuous chosen people of the Third World could be redeemed only by the mass killing of Europeans. As his interpreter, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, summarizing his views, quote, killing a European is killing two birds with one stone, eliminating in one go oppressor and oppressed, unquote. Not surprisingly, Fanon and the National Liberation Front, or FLN, he served, took inspiration from Nazi Germany, which had likewise positioned itself as an enslaved country fighting against European modernity. An Arab organizer for the Nazis, Johann von Leers, helped direct funds to the FLN while working for Egypt's Gamal Nasser in Cairo from 1955. Nasser had written a loving ode to Hitler during the war and brought 2,000 ex-Nazis to Cairo after the war to support his anti-colonial efforts. Von Leers was the author of such works as The Criminal Nature of the Jews, 1944, and after he moved to Cairo, The World Fight Against Imperialism and Colonialism. Third World struggle against colonial rule, von Leers believed, was a continuation of the Nazi fight against the colonial rule of the Treaty of Versailles. Fanon agreed. As he wrote, quote, when German militarism decides to resolve its border problems by force, it is no surprise. When the Algerians reject any method that does not involve violence, this too is proof that something has happened. The colonized peoples, these slaves of modern times, have run out of patience, unquote. Pascal Bruckner called Fanon's writings, quote, a treasure trove of theoretical nothingness, historical falsehood, and hateful demagoguery. All true. His writings are chaotic, error-filled, and venomous, but those are precisely the qualities that made them so powerful and attractive to legions of Third World revolutionaries. Fanon did not write learned analysis by hyperbolic rhetoric, and as rhetoric goes, it was top-notch, as good as Mein Kampf. In a 1995 book chapter entitled The Fascist Anti-Colonialism of Frantz Fanon, the German scholar Ilan Flegg points out that while Fanon initially adopted liberal advocacy along with other colonial reformers, in his later work, especially The Wretched of the Earth, we see, quote, the adoption of formerly anti-Semitic cliches and their straightforward application to the whites, unquote. The Jews had been hated for their economic and social success, which were seen as threats to an authentic, purified Christian Europe. In Fanon's hands, borrowing from Sartre, it was now the whites who were hated for the same reasons, constraining the authentic identities of the colonized. As Flegg writes, quote, Fanon makes race the subject of history, unquote. Does this sound familiar? Contemporary identity politics is similarly aggressively and reductively centered on race, an ineluctable and totalizing force that eliminates all individuality. The abandonment of liberal equality in favor of equity, racist anti-racism, or what we now call neo-racism, is the project of many contemporary writers, notably the Black American Ibram X. Kendi. Sartre, meanwhile, is the prologue of today's white allies like Robin DiAngelo, who arm the self-destructive tendencies of movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. As Ilan Flegg wrote, quote, Sartre issued a charter to those black authors who preached open racial hatred, and, in historical philosophical terms, appropriated their anti-human rights positions as necessary moments on the path to liberated humanity, unquote. Of course, we might be prone to dismiss Fanon as we dismiss the likes of Kendi as a lunatic and a bigot, but that does not change their baleful effects. Was violent revolution justified in Algeria circa 1955? France had ruled this part of North Africa since 1834. It had ousted the Ottoman Empire. The local languages, customs, music, literature, all had evolved under the supportive tutelage of French civilization. The evolution of civil government and citizenship in Algeria paralleled, indeed was often ahead of, similar developments in Europe itself. The native population swelled from 3 million in 1896 to 10 million by 1951, as French rule brought stability, food supplies, income, access to health. France, quite literally, gave birth to Algeria as a nation. In 1947, a democratization of the legislature began. A bicameral elected assembly was created with powers over finance. The first house was elected by 500,000 French nationals and Arabs with French citizenship. The second house, also composed of the same number of members, 60, was elected by 1.3 million natives. Whatever cavils we might have about this arrangement, circa 1947, it was the most democracy ever seen in North Africa and, ironically, the most democracy Algeria has ever seen since. Parties advocating immediate independence, along with communist parties, were allowed to run for office in the first election of 1948. The result? They only won 17 of the 60 seats in the second chamber. The Arab street wanted nothing to do with the likes of Fanon and the radicals. So what did the radicals do? Having failed with ballots, they turned to bullets. Gradual democratization was cut short by the eruption of a violent insurgency in 1954 that led to the unraveling of this experiment in a liberal Algeria. Frantz Fanon arrives in the Kasbah, and the rest is history. Fanon's violence is not justified. The French counterinsurgency is. Like Mao, Fanon believed that revolutionary violence in the service of Third World liberation was inherently justified, no matter the cost or consequences. It was the only route to Nazi-style cultural purification, and in this sense threw off the organized role of the vanguard party, much as Mao had done during the Cultural Revolution. Fanon, like other anti-colonial radicals, insisted on complete destruction of the political and economic systems of the colonial era. He was not seeking freedom or liberal equality, but terror and ethnic cleansing. The words used by his academic admirers today are therapeutic or curative violence. This is not just hatred of the West. Indeed, it's not just hatred of the white man. This is hatred of life itself, a nihilism that drew from French existentialists like Sartre and believed that a rootless and amoral authenticity was the only purpose of life, no matter the consequences. The results of groups like the FLN, who seized power throughout the Third World in the 1960s and 70s, notes German scholar Flegg, was democide. 350,000 Algerians killed in the war on French colonial rule. Another 12,000 FLN members executed within the organization itself as traitors. After so-called independence in 1962, further democide. Perhaps 50,000 Harkis who had fought for the French slaughtered. By 1988, the Algerian people referred to the FLN regime as La Ogra, meaning the contempt. The military shot 500 protesters that year. The army stepped into rule, and in 1992, it sent 18,000 people to internment camps in the Sahara Desert. A civil war erupted, killing 150,000 people before ending in 2000. As the Ethiopian philosopher Masay Kabedi wrote in a 2001 article on Fanon, quote, "When instead of being conserved and controlled, anger is given full vent, the outcome is rarely positive. History has repeatedly confirmed the sticking mania of violence," unquote. Kabedi should know this. In 1993, while teaching philosophy at Addis Ababa University, he was targeted by the maniacally violent Ethiopian government. He fled to the United States, where he was given asylum and a job at the University of Dayton. Quote, "As an active participant in the Algerian War of Liberation, Fanon believed that the ideals of the war would preside over the emergence of a modern and peaceful Algerian society," unquote. The ugly reality, as Kabedi wrote, quote, "invalidates the alleged creative role of violence," unquote. So, read Wretched of the Earth, if your professor assigns it, by all means, just as you should read Hitler's Mein Kampf, D'Angelo's White Fragility, or Kendi's How to be an Anti-Racist. Understand what these works represent. Then argue back. Tell your professor they are professing an evil creed. Take your C grade and chalk it up to a real education. I'm Dr. Bruce Gilley for Empire of the Mind.